worldviews are challenged is right here in the text. You look at verse 3, it said to the man, come here. He said to them, is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do harm, to save life or to kill? And they were silent. You know, I remember going to school and growing up, you'd be in class and teacher would ask, questions or whatever. And those students that are always eager to answer the questions, like Arnold Horshack back in the day, raising their, ooh, Mr. Carter, right? They're eager to answer the question, right? They're eager to answer the question, but there are times when a question might stump one of those teachers' pets. When a question might stump them so much so that they do not even say a word when the question's asked. And folk in the class looking at them like, I know you're going to answer. You answer every other question. I know. We even got some folk in the church, right? You know that one member that's always going to answer the question during Bible study, always going to raise the question, whatever. But there are some moments when all they can muster, silence. The silence lets us know that they were disconnected from what was going on. Silence lets us know whether they were daydreaming or whether they just didn't get it, that they were disconnected from this man with the withered hand and from Jesus. They were voyeurs, but weren't willing to be participants. They were good as long as they were able to watch the show, but they weren't going to participate in this deliverance. They were not going to actually give themselves up in this moment. They weren't even willing to answer the question. They weren't even willing to be bold enough to stand on one side or the other and say, well, we believe it's the Sabbath, so if you got to do harm, you just got to do harm. Weren't bold enough to say that. Weren't bold enough to say, well, it's the Sabbath, you got to kill, you just got to kill. They weren't bold enough to say that. They rather remain in the silence or in the anonymity of their silence and not deal with the reality of this individual's life that was right in front of them. I believe in this season, God is calling the church to actually stand up and to actually speak up in these type moments where the political pundits are saying one thing, where those on the hill called Capitol are talking about all these things about trying to say how your life matters and yours doesn't, and how this works and that doesn't, and how we should go this way instead of that way. The church needs to stand up and say, but there's another way, and it's God's way. God's looking for some individuals who are committed to the Lord in such a way that they'll say, like the old saints, for God I live and for God I die. I don't know what the challenge is for us from time to time, but I believe that Jesus is compelling us through his words to simply stand up and meet those that have needs. But Pastor, we haven't done it that way before. Pastor, we didn't go into that community before. We haven't gone to that side of the tracks before. Guess what? God doesn't care. God said, when I was hungry, did you feed me? When I was naked, did you give me some clothes? When I was homeless, did you give me somewhere to lay down my head? In other words, when I had a need, did you meet it? Perhaps some of our worldviews need to change from just following the way of the world to actually going the way of the Lord. So we see that when tradition meets transition, needs are exposed. When tradition meets transition, worldviews are challenged. But finally, and perhaps most importantly, when tradition meets transition, focus is redirected. Focus is redirected. It's right here in verse 5 and 6. It says, and he looked around at them with anger, grieved at their hardness of heart. There's another translation that says disappointed, heavy laden at their hardness of heart, and said to the man, stretch out your hand. Now this man had no feeling in his hand. This man had no strength in his hand. This man had no use of his hand. This man had learned how to do everything with his left hand. This man had learned how to do everything one-handed. I don't know. He learned how to eat with one hand. You know, when you get down to the last little bit of rice on your plate, it's hard to get all of it with just one hand. You know, when you're trying to cut that steak or that pork chop, it's hard to cut it with just one hand. Truth be told, if you go and try to pick up your child or your grandchild, it's hard, especially when it gets heavy as my son, to do it with one hand. You can't even wrap your arms around your loved ones right with just one hand. Typing is difficult with just one hand. Can you imagine playing the piano or the organ with just one hand? Imagine playing the drums with just one hand. This man had learned to live his life one-handed and was fine doing it. How do I know that? He didn't ask for anything. He was just in worship. He had gotten to the point in his life to say, God, if you never do another thing for me, you've already done more than enough. He basically got to the point in his life where he was saying, God, if you don't touch me again, you've already given me more than I deserve. He basically said in this text that I don't need any handouts. I really don't need you to do anything for me. I'm just here to praise and worship my God. But I got a sneaky suspicion and a funny feeling that this man, even though he did not necessarily come in needing anything, he had a feeling that if he went to the house of the Lord, that God was going to move. And if God was going to move, then maybe, just maybe, God will move in me. Maybe, just maybe, God will give me something that I've been looking for. I'm not making a public request, but I do have some things that I've only said in my secret closet late in the midnight hour. And I believe that this brother was there in church, and he was there expecting for God to move. And here it is, even if he didn't expect God to move for himself, he just knew God was in the moving business. God was in the blessing business, and God is in the transforming business, and God is in the transitioning business. And if God is doing all these things, then this man believed that maybe, just maybe, if God's in the neighborhood, I'll get a neighborly blessing as well. But the Pharaoh Pharisees could not handle this moment with the Lord. The Pharisees were mad because Jesus said, stretch out your hand, and the man's hand was restored. He gained strength that he didn't have before. He was undoubtedly happy. He was undoubtedly praising God. But the Pharisees, the church folk, the ones that were the keepers of the tradition, they just sat there, and the Bible says that they actually left church early and went on to hold a meeting to see how they could destroy Jesus. I stopped by to tell somebody there are those that want to destroy Jesus. There are those that want to diminish the power of the church. There are those that do not want people to be healed, do not want people to be changed, do not want people's lives delivered. There are those that cannot handle when God blesses others. There are those who cannot handle when God is moving. But notice in the text, when we walked in verse 1, the Pharisees weren't paying Jesus attention, and the Pharisees weren't paying the man attention. But by the time we get to verse 6, the Pharisees, they're looking at Jesus. The Pharisees, they're looking at that man. How do I know that? Because if they had not seen him, they would not have gotten mad. And I stopped by to tell you, keep on praying, keep on singing, keep on preaching, keep on serving, because your witness is your worship to God. When you give God the praise, when you give God the glory, when you heal the sick, when you meet the needs, that's when the enemy sees and gets mad and plots to destroy. But the story doesn't end there. The story doesn't end there. They plotted to destroy Jesus, and they thought a few years later that they had succeeded when they marched him up Golgotha's brow, when they hung him high and stretched him wide. I'm preaching for myself now. When he hung his head in the locks of his shoulder, and for you and me, he died. The Bible says he died till the sun refused to shine. He died till the moon dripped red in blood. He died, he died, he died, but he did not stay there in that destroyed state. He went down in the grave, but early Sunday morning, he got up with all power, healing power, way-making power, delivering power in his hand. Is there anybody in the room today that knows that God is able to do anything but fail? God is able to help you live into the transition that God's got afoot. God is moving, and you and I have to go with God, because all power is at our disposal. It's it's one of those things that Jesus died, rose from dead. If you recall, told his disciples, look, greater works than these are you going to be able to do. Not because you're all that in a bag of chips plus a red Kool-Aid, but because my spirit is with you. I don't know about you, but I stand boldly wherever I am because I know God's spirit is with me.